Hey guys, tonight, the darkness of the pre-dawn hour was not a quiet darkness. It was a dense, cold stillness, punctuated by the rhythmic, exhausted breathing of a dozen bodies packed into the servants' dormitory above the stables. For Alara, the darkness was also a ticking clock, and the silence a deceit. A great, bellowing clang from the main hall's bell tore through the stillness. It was the Lord Steward, striking the hour, 5 of the clock. In the world of the medieval manor, 5 a.m. was not the beginning of the day, it was the beginning of the relentless grind. There was no gentle transition from rest to work. There was only the shock of cold air, the scramble of clumsy, stockinged feet, and the immediate pressure of perfection. Ilara, a housemaid barely 19, felt the familiar dread coil in her stomach. She slid from her straw mattress, her muscles aching before she had even taken a single step. Every maid in the dormitory shared the same unspoken goal: to move like a shadow, to work like a force of nature, and to be invisible to the noble family upstairs. The first most crucial task was the fires of life. The immense manor, Lord Beaufort's sprawling stone fortress, was a beast that demanded constant feeding. Ilara and the other junior maids had to be downstairs in the great hall long before the first yawn from the family's chamber. They carried heavy, rough-woven sacks, descending the narrow, slippery servants' staircase. In the cavernous, freezing hall, the night's embers in the great stone hearths were barely glowing. Ilara immediately set to the work, her breath clouding in the bitter air. She knelt, scraped out the old ashes with a small flat shovel, and swept the debris into a bucket, the gritty dust stinging her eyes. This was the first of countless physical strains, the bending, the lifting, the carrying of soot and spent wood. Next came the laying of new kindling. She carefully stacked thin, dry twigs, topped by progressively thicker logs, preparing the colossal fireplaces that would eventually warm the hall and the kitchens. Her hands were raw and splintered, but speed was paramount. The smoke from the struggling, nascent flames filled the space, a bitter perfume marking the start of her day. Simultaneously, others were battling the second, back-breaking chore, the water run. In the pantry, a line of maids formed, hoisting heavy, iron-bound buckets. Ilara joined them, gripping the wooden handle until her knuckles were white. There was no indoor plumbing. Every drop of water for washing, cooking, and brewing ale had to be hauled from the outside well. It was a perilous trek across the icy courtyard, a constant drain on strength. The buckets clanged against the stone as she carried the load back, a silent, painful reminder of the 100 flights of stairs and narrow passageways ahead. By 5:30 a.m., the first fires were flickering. The great hall smelled faintly of wood smoke, and the first gallons of cold water sat waiting in the kitchens. Ilara, already exhausted, hadn't even started her designated job of cleaning the family's private sitting room. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, the grime streaking her skin. The sun had not yet risen, but the drudgery had already taken hold. Her own comfort, her own fatigue meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was that by the time the first noble foot touched the floor at 7 a.m., the household must be warm, clean, and entirely ready for the day of luxury that she and the other servants were working themselves to death to provide. Ilara wiped the last smear of soot from her face, the faint light of the newly stoked fire making the great hall less a welcoming space and more a vast, cold theater of class distinction. Even within the servants' ranks, a stark, often cruel hierarchy dictated every gesture, every tone, and every interaction. It was a second invisible chains. At the very pinnacle of the servant world, the upstairs of the downstairs, stood Master Giles, the steward. Giles was the Lord's mouthpiece, the supreme governor of the domestic realm. He managed the estate's finances, oversaw all staff, and carried the heavy weight of the master's trust. He was a man of stern face and expensive, if drab, woolen clothes, carrying a silver-tipped staff of office. He ate better than some minor nobility, often dining at a table just below the family's dais. When Giles spoke, even the mighty cook and the dignified butler jumped. His position was one of enormous power and little pity. He could make or break a servant's career with a single, cool glance. The butler was the keeper of the wine cellar, the pantry, and, crucially, the silver and plate. He commanded the serving staff during meals and held a near-sacred position of trust, often sleeping near the family's valuables. I once saw him dismiss a serving boy for merely looking longingly at a bottle of French wine. His authority was absolute over the junior staff who served the table. Mistress Agnes, the housekeeper, was Ilara's direct terror. She was responsible for the cleanliness of the manor, the linen, and the running of the maids. Agnes, a woman whose own years of toil had hardened her, managed her girls with sharp, biting words and constant vigilance. She was the one who inspected Ilara's sweeping, who checked the dryness of the chamber pots, and whose disapproval often meant a beating or a denial of the evening meal. Beneath these officers were the skilled workers, the cook, the groom, and the chaplain, who held specialized, respected positions. The cook, a large, loud man named Osbert, ruled his kitchen like a fortress, delegating the most vile tasks, like plucking fowl or cleaning offal, to his subordinates. And then, at the very bottom, were the scullions and the junior maids, the lowest echelon, the perpetual scapegoats, Ilara's rank. Ilara knew the rules implicitly. She would never address the butler directly unless addressed first. She must never, under any circumstances, allow her eyes to linger on the steward's signet ring. And to the scullery maid, the girl whose entire life was scrubbing the endless grease from pots in the scullery, Ilara might occasionally issue a wearied yet formal command. The humiliation flowed down the chain like water, ensuring that even the most wretched soul had someone lowered to feel superior to. It was the manor's perverse method of maintaining order. Keep them divided, keep them controlled. As Ilara started hauling water up the narrow, damp staircase to the second floor, a small boy, a page, scurried past her, his face flushed with the privilege of carrying a message for the steward. He didn't even see her, or perhaps he consciously chose not to. To him, Ilara was less than the stone of the staircase. To the butler, she was an implement, and to the steward, she was simply a number on a ledger. This was the hierarchy, and it guaranteed that Ilara's drudgery would never earn her respect, only the right to another day of toil.
The Manor of Blackwood was not merely a house, it was a complex, self-sustaining organism structured around one profound deception, that the noble life was effortless. This illusion was maintained by the ruthless, hidden geography of the estate, a physical manifestation of the class divide. Ilara existed in the perpetual cold transit between two worlds. The first was the grand stage, the public face of Lord Beaufort's prestige. When she ascended to the upper floors, she entered a silent, sunlit realm designed to impress. Here were the drawing rooms, where the lady received guests, filled with imported silks and scented with dried lavender. The library, where books were chained not for safety, but for display. And the opulent private chambers, vast spaces where even the air felt richer. In these chambers, every action was a careful ritual. Laying the fire required precision so the smoke never back-puffed. Polishing the pewter demanded endless, meticulous rubbing. Ilara's presence here had to be silent, her movements efficient, her focus absolute. She was less a person and more a human utility, designed to operate without intrusion. A single glance at the lord's coat of arms or a moment of hesitation near the lady's jewelry box could be interpreted as insolence or worse, theft. The high ceilings and wide windows that offered the nobility light and air only seemed to amplify the sense of exposure for the servant below. But the true veins of the manor belonged to the downstairs, the shadow network that kept the grand stage alive. The essential connection was the servants' staircase. It was not a single entity, but a series of interconnected, steep and uneven stone treads, worn concave over centuries by the unending ascent and descent of tired bodies carrying heavy loads. Tucked into the very core of the thick stone walls, they were perpetually dark, relying on the weak, flickering glow of a single tallow lamp or a sliver of distant light from a basement grate. These stairs bypassed the main, beautifully carved grand staircase entirely. To use the grand stairs was an unforgivable intrusion. The back stairs were a requirement of existence. Ilara carried her burden, whether it was heavy linen, a bucket of coals, or, worst of all, the sloshing contents of the chamber pots, up and down these treacherous steps scores of days. Her muscles constantly burned, her shins ached, and the damp air of the stone kept a persistent chill in her bones. She learned to feel the steps beneath her feet, a necessary skill when the light was often too poor to see. Below ground level lay the heart of the labor, the kitchens, the larder, and the scullery. These rooms were a world unto themselves, hot, loud, and thick with the odors of roasting meat, stale ale, and wood smoke. The kitchen was a place of high drama, ruled by the bellowing, tyrannical cook Osbert. Here, Ilara was less invisible than she was expendable, a tool to be ordered and screamed at. The stone floor was eternally sticky with grease, and the heat from the immense hearths was suffocating, a stark contrast to the freezing dormitories above. Connected to the kitchen was the tiny windowless scullery, the domain of the lowest maids. This was a cavern of endless work, where pots and pans from the previous night's feast were scrubbed clean with sand and coarse brushes. The water was always cold, the work unending, and the isolation nearly complete. Upstairs, near the roofline, were the cramped, cold dormitories, the maids' quarters. Low-ceilinged and perpetually smelling of old straw and unwashed bodies, these were the only places Ilara and her peers could truly rest, though even here the strict rules of silence and hierarchy persisted. Sleep was a hurried necessity, not a comfort. The spatial arrangement was a brilliant instrument of control. By physically separating the worlds, the nobility was spared the unpleasant reality of their comfort. They never saw the sheer filth of the scullery, never heard the weeping on the back stairs, and were never forced to confront the exhaustion on the face of the maid who just hauled their washing water from the well. Ilara's constant passage between the dark, functional chaos of the downstairs and the bright, sterile facade of the upstairs made her a true, if silent, observer of the manor's dual reality. She was a necessary ghost, a reminder that the luxurious life on the grand stage was literally built upon the sweat and secrecy of the backstairs. Her small, mundane chores were the foundations of Lord Beaufort's power, yet she was condemned to live and work in the shadows she created.
While the skilled assistants, the sorcerer, the baker, and the turnspit, focused on the complex dishes, Ilara and the scullions were given the dirty, repetitive, and vile preparations. This included the grim necessity of cleaning and preparing meat and fish. They spent hours plucking feathers from dozens of chickens and geese, their fingers cramped and cold. They scaled and gutted fish brought fresh from the river, the smell clinging to their skin and clothes for days. For feasts, They prepared the offal, the livers, hearts, and entrails, which were often stewed for the servants, while the prime cuts went to the nobles. Cook Osbert's kitchen was a whirlwind of activity designed to produce meals that lasted hours and often contained dozens of separate dishes: roasted swan, great pies filled with pigeons, spiced pottages, and sweet custards. Ilara's direct job was often the most basic and physically demanding: pumping the bellows, keeping the immense fires at the perfect blistering heat for roasting the large joints of meat, a tireless, sweat-inducing task. The pestle and mortar, grinding spices and herbs for hours, a monotonous task that left her arms numb. Washing, endlessly scrubbing the greasy wooden platters and cooking cauldrons in the scullery, a humid, miserable appendix to the kitchen. The sheer volume of food was staggering, a deliberate display of wealth. The servants, ironically, often went hungry despite being surrounded by food. They ate the leftovers, the scraps, and the lesser cuts, known as the remains of the hall. Ilara often saw vast amounts of perfectly edible food spoiled or tossed to the dogs, a casual display of extravagance that felt like a cruel mockery to her empty stomach. As the noon meal approached, the chaos intensified. Osbert barked orders, striking lazy or clumsy servants with a wooden spoon or a ladle. Ilara, covered in soot, flour, and fish scales, focused solely on the task at hand, her mind numbed from the labor. The success of Lord Beaufort's lavish dinner party tonight and his reputation among the gentry rested entirely on her ability to perfectly execute the grunt work that made the glory possible. She was a silent cog in a massive, hungry machine, where her only reward was the brief, fleeting survival to face tomorrow's dawn. If the kitchen was the manor's hot, frantic heart, the buttery was its cool, secured mind. It was a space governed not by muscle and sweat, but by sobriety, accounting, and above all, trust. And the absolute ruler of this domain was Master Thomas, the butler. Thomas was a figure of quiet and immense authority. Unlike the volatile cook Osbert or the scolding housekeeper Agnes, Thomas rarely raised his voice. His power lay in his indispensable function and his direct, confidential relationship with Lord Beaufort. He was not a laboring servant. He was an executive, a curator of the manor's most liquid and most valuable assets. His title, butler, derived from the Old French bouteiller, meaning bottle man, but his responsibilities went far beyond simply serving drink. The buttery, an armored room adjacent to the Great Hall, was his fortress. Here he controlled and dispensed the crucial goods that underpinned the lord's status: the wine and ale, casks of common beer for the servants, barrels of good English ale for the family, and, most importantly, the sealed, precious bottles of French and Spanish wine reserved for feasts and high-status guests. The plate, the entire collection of silver and pewter, spoons, flagons, serving dishes, items that were not merely tableware, but a portable form of family wealth, often melted down to fund wars or dowries. The napery and candles, fine linens for the noble table, and the expensive beeswax candles that illuminated the grand stage, distinguishing it from the servants' dim, tallow-lit quarters. Thomas held a large, intricately worked ring of keys, the true symbol of his power. These keys granted him access not just to the buttery, but often to the lord's private chests and occasionally the external storehouses. In a world where coinage was scarce and wealth was tangible, these keys were the literal measure of his master's confidence. To be given charge of the cellar was to be trusted with a fortune. His high status afforded him privileges denied to the likes of Ilara. He wore fine, dark broadcloth, not livery. He had a private chamber, small but secure, usually located near the lord's own to ensure he was always on hand.
and while he ate his meals with the upper tier of the staff, his food was of significantly better quality than the scullion's watery pottage. Thomas's work was meticulous. Every bottle drawn, every cloth laundered, and every piece of silver polished had to be recorded in his ledgers. He was a professional accountant as much as a server. The slightest discrepancy, a missing spoon, an empty cask unaccounted for, would not only lead to his dismissal, but could implicate him in a charge of theft, a crime punishable by death. The stakes were impossibly high. His primary duty and the greatest display of his power occurred during the formal meals. He oversaw the setting of the high table, ensuring the placement of every trencher and the correct wine for every course. During the feast, he was a silent, commanding presence at the sideboard. He poured the wine, sampled it first, a vestige of the ancient duty of testing for poison, and supervised the lower serving staff, the very maids and pages Ilara worked alongside, with an unwavering critical eye. Ilara rarely interacted directly with Thomas, but when she did, the tension was palpable. She might be tasked with polishing a piece of silver under his direct supervision, or carrying a basin of hot water into the buttery for cleaning. In his presence, she was acutely aware of her own grime and low status. Thomas represented the ceiling of the servant's ambition, a life of security, high esteem, and proximity to power, purchased by years of absolute, unblinking fidelity. Yet even Thomas lived in a gilded cage. He could never marry without the Lord's express permission, and he was fundamentally alone. His trust was his prison. He was surrounded by wealth that was not his own, aware that the key ring on his hip was also the ultimate chain around his neck. The knowledge and secrets he absorbed while serving the Lord were both his asset and his biggest liability, ensuring his life was lived in constant, polished perfection, always on guard against the slightest threat to his prized, high-status domain.
The private chambers of Lord and Lady Beaufort were the manor's innermost sanctuary, places where the veneer of noble formality occasionally slipped. To serve here was to hold a position of incredible proximity and danger. These servants, the valet and the gentlewoman, operated at the delicate intersection of public duty and private intimacy, absorbing a stream of chamber secrets that defined their high-stakes roles. Ilara, the common maid, only entered these rooms for the coarsest duties, hauling water, managing the chamber pot, and scraping out the fireplace. She performed these tasks early, before the nobility was fully awake, and retreated quickly. The real power in these private spaces belonged to the personal attendants. For Lord Beaufort, that attendant was Master Perrin, the valet. Perrin was more than a mere dresser. He was the keeper of the Lord's person and confidence. He slept on a pallet near the Lord's door, ready to be summoned day or night. His tasks were intensely personal. He assisted with the Lord's complicated dressing ritual, lacing the hose, arranging the doublet, polishing the fine leather shoes. He managed the Lord's shaving, oversaw the care of his hunting gear, and ensured his private accounts and papers were orderly. The valet's access was unprecedented. He knew the Lord's true mood before anyone else, understood the ache in his master's knees when the weather changed, and was often the silent witness to midnight visitors or whispered political discussions. Because he handled the Lord's purse and weapons, trust was paramount. Perrin's high status was evident in his bearing. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, speaking only when spoken to, his eyes always observing. His greatest value was his discretion. Perrin heard the Lord's drunken regrets, his marital complaints, and his schemes against neighboring estates. These secrets were a form of currency. If Perrin kept silent, he was rewarded with fine clothing, better food, and perhaps a small annuity upon the Lord's death. If he betrayed the secrets, even inadvertently, he faced ruin, or worse. Ilara had once seen Perrin receive a gold coin after successfully arranging a clandestine meeting for the Lord. It was a tangible symbol of the heavy silence he maintained. Eleanor,
was a woman of good if impoverished birth, making her status less that of a servant and more that of a companion. She dressed the lady, managed her elaborate headwear and jewelry, and prepared the herbal baths. She was the one who read aloud, who provided conversation during long afternoons, and who acted as the conduit for all communication from the outside world to the secluded lady. The lady's chambers were a place of complex emotional currents. Eleanor was privy to the lady's insecurities, her jealousies, and her frequent frustrations with her husband's infidelities or political demands. The gentlewoman was expected to offer comfort and loyalty, but never challenge or advise unless specifically asked. Her role required a masterful manipulation of subtle flattery and deference. The greatest risk for both Perrin and Eleanor was being drawn into the nobility's marital disputes. If the lord and lady fought, the attendants were expected to be invisible, yet they were often forced to convey messages, act as spies, or cover up embarrassments. They walked a knife edge, constantly judging which master to appease and when to simply disappear into the expensive shadows. Ilara felt the weight of the attendant's status every time she saw Perrin glide effortlessly down the back stairs, carrying a letter wrapped in red silk, or when Eleanor imperiously dismissed her from the lady's presence. They were servants, yet they possessed a level of refined life and influence that Ilara could only dream of. They did not scrub floors or haul water. They dealt in information and loyalty. In the end, Ilara realized that while the valet and the gentlewoman lived a far more comfortable life, their servitude was more refined, but no less binding. Their chains were made of silk and secrecy, but they were chains nonetheless, tethering them irrevocably to the fluctuating fortunes and dangerous private lives of their masters. Once again, I cannot generate a full 4,000-word story in this single response due to platform limitations. However, I will provide a substantial and emotionally resonant chapter, approximately 750 to 800 words, using your subtitle, The Cold Comfort of the Hall, Sleeping Arrangements and Scarcity. This section will bring Ilara's narrative to the end of her relentless day, focusing on the harsh reality of the servants' communal living and the persistent hunger they faced. The Great Hall, the centerpiece of Lord Beaufort's prestige during the day, transformed every night into the communal crowded dormitory for the lowest-ranking servants. After 16 hours of tireless labor, a long day of fetching, cleaning, and cooking that stretched well past the final toasts of the noble dinner, Ilara's only reward was the cold comfort of the hall. Sleep was not a restorative luxury. It was a hurried necessity, an attempt to briefly reset the exhausted body before the bell chimed 5 a.m. once more. The shift began after the final clearing of the evening feast. Under the grudging eye of the housekeeper, Agnes, Ilara and the junior maids helped clear the tables and remove the expensive tapestries and cushions. Then the hall's transformation commenced. The vast, echoing space, still faintly smelling of wine and roasted meat, was quickly populated by the manor's workers who had no dedicated quarters. For Ilara, a junior housemaid, and the pages and grooms, the floor was the bed. They unrolled their meager, rough straw pallets, lumpy mattresses stuffed with chaff that offered minimal insulation from the cold stone beneath. A single shared scratchy woolen blanket was distributed between 2 or sometimes 3 sleepers. There was no concept of privacy. The stable hands, the kitchen boys, the scullions, and the maids all slept together in rows, side by side, forced into a crude intimacy by necessity. The physical conditions were brutal. Even with the massive fireplaces banked, the stone walls radiated a penetrating cold, especially during the long, dark medieval winters. Drafts snaked across the floor, chilling Ilara to the bone. She learned to curl up into a tight, miserable ball, sometimes pressing against the warmer body of a nearby maid, seeking any measure of borrowed heat. The noise was constant. The hall was still a thoroughfare. Guards changed shifts, the steward might pass through on a late errand,
and the perpetual snoring, coughing, and restless turning of dozens of bodies made true, deep rest a rarity. The fear of fire, of rats, and of the sudden summons by a noble who needed a cup of water or a fire stoked meant that even in sleep, the servant's mind was not truly at peace. Adding to the physical misery was the perpetual agony of scarcity. Despite spending her entire day surrounded by food, preparing lavish roasts, rich sauces, and sweet pastries for the nobility, Ilara always went to bed hungry. The servants' diet was deliberately meager. Their meal, taken after the nobility had finished, consisted of the remains of the hall, the stew made from organ meats, offal, watery vegetable pottage, and hard, stale trenchers of bread that the nobles had used as plates. They drank small beer, a weak, thin ale that was barely nourishing. Tonight, after clearing away the leftovers from a 4-course feast, Ilara had managed to scrape only a thin layer of beef fat onto her crust of bread. It did nothing to silence the gnawing ache in her stomach. The rich, enticing smells of the kitchen seemed to cruelly linger in the hall, a mocking reminder of the disparity. She often watched, heartbroken, as the pages gathered up scraps of noble food, half-eaten pies and whole joints of meat to be given to the hounds, food that would have nourished her for days. The lack of nourishment ensured that the maids were always operating at a deficit of energy, making the next day's labor even harder. The scarcity was a key element of the control mechanism. A constantly tired, slightly malnourished servant was a more compliant servant, less likely to rebel or run away. As Ilara finally lay down on her pallet, pulling the rough blanket over her chin, she pressed her cold hands to her empty stomach. The vast, ornate ceiling high above the hall seemed to mock her small, freezing form. In this shared, miserable darkness, where the whispers of the other exhausted sleepers blended with the draft's low moan, she found her only fragile solace, a brief, stolen oblivion before the bell would ring again, dragging her back to the dawn of drudgery.
The clothes a person wore in medieval society were not merely garments. They were a meticulously coded language of rank, wealth, and belonging. For the servants of the Manor of Blackwood, their attire, their uniforms of servitude, was the clearest indicator that their bodies and their loyalties were property of the Lord. The clothing provided to Ilara was a coarse, practical necessity, a harsh contract woven into the fabric. She wore the livery of the household, a uniform that, while better than the rags of the truly poor, was deliberately rough and distinguishing. Her gown was made of coarse, undyed wool or cheap linsey woolsey, drab in color, usually a dull brown, gray, or undyed sheep's wool. The fabric was heavy, itchy, and difficult to keep clean, absorbing the pervasive odors of smoke, sweat, and the kitchen. This livery served a dual purpose. First, it immediately identified her as Lord Beaufort's servant both inside and outside the manor walls. Second, its material ensured that she would never be mistaken for a woman of free status or, God forbid, a noblewoman. The fabric was a constant, itchy reminder of her station. However, within the walls of the downstairs, the livery took on a complex internal meaning, establishing a rigid system of status and hand-me-downs. The quality and color of the clothing were direct reflections of a servant's authority and proximity to the Lord. At the very top, Master Thomas, the butler, and Master Perrin, the valet, wore the highest quality cloth. Their garments were often made of fine dark wool, trimmed with a hint of the Lord's specific heraldic colors, a subtle touch of blue or gold that marked them as highly trusted, personal attendants. Their clothing was tailored, regularly cleaned, and sometimes even pressed. Their attire lent them an air of dignity and made them look less like servants and more like minor officials. Mid-level servants like cook Osbert and the housekeeper Agnes wore sturdy, specialized work clothes. Osbert's linen apron and thick, practical tunic were constantly covered in grease, but they were his own domain. He was a professional artisan. Agnes wore durable gowns, often the hand-me-downs of the lady's less fashionable dresses, which gave her a slightly higher look but often required desperate private mending. Ilara and the junior laids existed at the bottom of the clothing ladder. Their gowns were the result of a long cycle of decay and reuse. A dress, once outgrown by a slightly higher-ranked maid, was passed down. The fabric was often patched multiple times, and the cut was shapeless, designed for maximum utility rather than comfort or appearance. The patches were another subtle mark of low rank. They showed that the garment had seen many years of hard labor and was not worth the cost of replacement. The footwear was equally telling. The higher servants wore sturdy leather boots. Ilara and the kitchen staff wore simple hard leather shoes or clogs that provided little protection against the cold stone or the wet floors. The true moment of visual humiliation came when Ilara had to move through the grand stage. Clad in her rough, stained wool, she was an abrasive contrast to the silks, furs, and imported fabrics worn by the nobility. Her clothes made her feel heavy and clumsy, a physical embodiment of the dirt and labor that the nobles sought to ignore. Sometimes, after a great feast or a noble's death, the servants might be rewarded with pieces of their master's old clothes. A page might receive a slightly worn doublet. A maid might get a discarded length of linen. But these hand-me-downs were always ill-fitting, often smelled of the master's rich perfumes, and carried a dual sting, a momentary sense of privilege coupled with the acute shame of wearing the remnants of someone else's discarded luxury. As Ilara mended a tear in the shoulder of her tunic one cold evening, a hole caused by snagging on the rough back stairs, she knew this uniform was her destiny. It was her protection against the cold, her badge of identity, and the permanent, visible sign that she was not her own person, but merely a functional component of Lord Beaufort's vast, unfeeling household machine. The true burden of servitude was not the physical labor. It was the psychological weight of being the silent witness. The servants, invisible by design, were constantly present during the nobility's most private moments, making them privy to the volatile world of chamber secrets, gossip, and surveillance. Ilara, the low-ranking housemaid, had a unique vantage point. The very fabric of her daily tasks forced her into the proximity of the lord and lady's unguarded lives. When she was cleaning the ashes in the lord's study, she heard the muffled, furious arguments he had with his steward over tenants and rents. When she emptied the lady's washing basin, she sometimes saw discarded letters, crumpled and hastily thrown aside, hinting at distant relatives or desperate financial demands. These secrets, intended for noble ears only, floated down to the servants' quarters as dangerous fragments. The most potent currency in the downstairs was gossip. Whispers traveled through the manor like cold drafts, carried from the upper chambers by the valet and the gentlewoman, filtered through the high-status cook and butler, and finally circulated among the maids and scullions. Tonight, after the household had settled, Ilara heard a particularly chilling piece of gossip near the buttery door. A groom was murmuring to another maid that Lord Beaufort was considering raising taxes on his villages to pay for a new hunting expedition, a decision that would spell ruin and starvation for the common folk, perhaps even her own family nearby. The temptation to share this information, to discuss the injustice, was enormous, but the dangers of speaking out were immediate and terrifying. The entire manor was under a constant system of surveillance. The steward and the housekeeper were the lord's eyes and ears, their primary function being to monitor the staff for insolence, theft, or treasonous talk. They understood that a unified, informed body of servants was a threat to noble control. The highest-ranking servants, the butlers and valets, were arguably the most dangerous. They were deeply invested in the lord's success and were incentivized to report even the slightest sign of sedition among the lower staff. A loose word, a cynical sigh, or an expression of sympathy for a disgraced former courtier could be relayed up the chain of command and result in instant violent punishment. Ilara knew the chilling cautionary tale of the pantry boy Thomas, who was brutally beaten and dismissed a year prior. His crime, he had foolishly repeated a joke he overheard from a nobleman that cast the lord's mother in a poor light. The joke was trivial,
but his speaking it was a capital offense against the loyalty required of his uniform. To survive, Ilara had to cultivate an impossible skill: absolute silence and outward ignorance. When Master Perrin, the valet, emerged looking haggard after a late-night council meeting in the Lord's chamber, Ilara was cleaning the hallway. She saw the worry etched on his face, a worry that suggested more than just politics was at stake. She immediately averted her eyes, ensuring her expression remained blank, her movements slow and docile. She knew she had witnessed a moment of truth, but she had to convey that she had seen nothing at all. Her mind, however, acted as a relentless private ledger. She catalogued every significant detail: the lady's clandestine use of a specific coded phrase in her letters, the hidden door in the tapestry that the Lord used for secret meetings, the precise shade of red on the lips of a visiting unmarried guest. These were the chamber secrets she absorbed through the air, the walls, and the discarded remnants of the noble life. This forced silence was a heavy internal burden. It meant she could never truly trust the other maids, who might, out of fear or for a small reward, betray her. It meant she lived in a state of perpetual psychological tension, holding the fate of powerful men in her silent knowledge. Ilara was a powerless observer of great events. She knew that her best chance at survival was to remain a shadow, a functional automaton whose lips were sealed by fear, ensuring she would remain the silent witness until the day she could finally walk away.
To the Lord and Lady of Blackwood, the cost of keeping a servant like Ilara was merely a line item in a sprawling, complex household account. But for Ilara, the subject of wages and wares represented the thin, fragile bridge between her current servitude and the distant promise of a future, a life free from the back stairs. The direct payment for a junior housemaid was pitifully small. Ilara's annual wage was a mere handful of shillings, paid not with the modern regularity of weekly coin, but in irregular, often annual installments. These wages, formally recorded by the steward, barely represented the true value of her labor. The bulk of her compensation was understood to be her room, her meager board, the remains of the hall, and the rough clothing, the uniform of servitude, provided by the manor. In the peasant economy, actual cash was scarce, and its value was immense. Ilara carefully wrapped her few coins in a scrap of linen, hiding them beneath her straw pallet. This money was not for immediate necessities, as those were technically provided by the Lord. It was for her escape. The real, unwritten economy of servitude revolved around perquisites, the unofficial tips, privileges, and small, tangible benefits that often determined whether a servant survived or starved. Perquisites were everything that could be slyly acquired or secretly gifted. Candle ends and scraps, the right to collect the small melted ends of tallow or beeswax candles from the hall, which provided light for her lonely nightly chore of mending. The cook's benevolence, an occasional grudging gift of a bone with a little meat still clinging to it, slipped to her by a less vicious assistant cook. Worn goods, permission to take a heavily worn or slightly ripped piece of cloth or linen that the housekeeper deemed useless. These small wares were vital. Ilara could trade the salvaged candle wax for a few hen's eggs in the village, or use the linen scraps to mend her own clothing or to make tiny marketable pouches. This shadow economy was dangerous. Any possession that could not easily be justified was assumed stolen, making every perquisite a secret treasure and a potential liability. The pressure to receive tips was constant. While the butler and valet might receive coins or even a piece of used noble clothing from a grateful master, a maid's tips were usually far less. Guests upon leaving the manor might dispense small copper coins to the visible servants, a gifting practice that was less charity and more a display of their own generosity. Ilara learned where to stand, how to curtsy quickly, and when to be most useful, hoping to catch the eye of a departing nobleman's squire. Yet every meager saving was fueled by a single, powerful ambition, the promise of a future. For Ilera, this promise had a clear, concrete form, a dowry. As a young woman, Ilera knew that service in the household was often a temporary stage, a means to gather the necessary sum of money and goods that would make her an attractive marriage prospect. Her father, a poor tenant farmer, could provide little. The shillings she saved were intended to purchase a small piece of land, a goat, or the necessary cooking pots that would form her contribution to a marriage, her ticket out of servitude. For the young man in the hall, the promise of a future meant accumulating capital to start a trade. Many of the pages and grooms were learning basic literacy, estate management, or skills in the stables, hoping to eventually leave to become a carpenter, a blacksmith, or a bailiff on a smaller estate. Ilera's labor, therefore, was doubly motivated. She worked to survive the day, and she worked to save for the distant, hypothetical day she would leave. Every scraped-together shilling was a nail driven into the coffin of her servitude. She knew that her small cachet of coins was not just wealth, it was leverage. It was the possibility of choosing her own master, her own husband, rather than being dictated by the whims of Lord Beaufort. One evening, counting her tiny hoard, a grand total of 3 shillings and 4 pence, she felt a familiar rush of hope. If she remained healthy and lucky, avoiding the housekeeper's ire and the constant temptation to spend, she might in 3 or 4 more years have enough. The wages and wares she gathered were the tangible evidence that her brutal, relentless life had a purpose beyond just warming the Lord's bedsheets. It was slowly, painstakingly buying her freedom. The life of a junior housemaid was a relentless cycle of tasks defined not by skill or artistry, but by sheer grueling physical endurance and the handling of the manor's filth. Among the endless chores, 2 stood out as the most physically punishing and psychologically degrading: the daily ordeal of managing the fires and the vile necessity of emptying the chamber pots. These were Ilera's constant trials by task. The task of tending the fireplace was a brute force contest against the medieval cold. Lord Beaufort's manor contained dozens of hearths, but the largest and most demanding were the massive fireplaces in the great hall and the private chambers. This trial began at dawn and lasted deep into the night. It was an endless, repetitive cycle. 1. The scrape. Scraping out the thick, cold ash and embers from the previous night, a choking, dusty task that left Ilera's lungs heavy and her hands filthy. The buckets of ash were cumbersome and had to be carried down the slippery back stairs and dumped far outside the manor walls. 2. The hall. Fetching the wood. The wood stores were always located at a distance to prevent accidental fires. Ilera had to carry heavy bundles of logs, often strapped to her back or carried in rough sacks, the splintered bark tearing at her rough woolen clothes and scraping her skin. The fireplace was a beautiful display of warmth for the nobles, but for Ilera it was a source of constant, punishing strain. Yet this trial by fire was arguably less repulsive than the trial by waste, the emptying of the chamber pots.
In the noble world, personal waste management was a servant's duty. Every morning, Ilera had to enter the lords' and ladies' private chambers, the most intimate, guarded spaces, to perform this task. The chamber pots, usually ceramic or pewter vessels kept under the beds, contained the accumulated human waste from the night. The job demanded a total suspension of dignity. Ilera had to enter quietly, retrieve the pot without looking at the sleeping or dressing nobles, and carry the sloshing, heavy container down multiple flights of stairs to the nearest gong farm or latrine pit outside the castle. The worst part was the smell, which was overwhelming, especially in the cold, still morning air. The risk of spilling was enormous. A single slip on the steep, narrow back stairs could lead to a horrific accident,
staining the walls and her clothes and guaranteeing a beating. She moved with agonizing slowness, the stench rising up her nose, reminding her of the absolute, visceral contempt the nobles held for the messy reality of their own bodies, a reality they outsourced entirely to her. The constant need for fetching water amplified this misery. Every drop for washing the chamber pots, for cooking, and for the nobility's washing basins had to be hauled by hand from the well in the courtyard. The cold, heavy buckets of water strained her arms and shoulders, further exhausting the body she needed to carry the waste. The water that granted the nobles their cleanliness was what contributed to Ilara's constant exhaustion and perpetual dirtiness. By noon, Ilara was not just tired, she was physically depleted, covered in the residual dust of ashes and the faint lingering smell of sewage, even after washing her hands in the cold water. These trials by task ensured that her life remained strictly divided. She created warmth and cleanliness for her masters by immersing herself in cold, dirt, and drudgery. Her labor was a daily, humbling ritual of contact with the manor's lowest, most repulsive necessities. In the cold architecture of the medieval manor, the most fundamental law was not codified justice, but the absolute and terrifying power of the master. For Ilara and every servant, life was governed by the fear of dismissal and the chilling inevitability of physical discipline. Every action, every whispered word was weighed against the price of presence. The rules governing a servant's behavior were simple: obedience, silence, and total submission. Any deviation, a slow response, a clumsy spill, or a look deemed insolent, constituted misconduct. Punishment was swift, brutal, and often public, serving as a chilling lesson to the entire household. The housekeeper, Mistress Agnes, was the chief enforcer of discipline among the maids. She did not use a refined cane or switch. Her punishment was often a sudden, open-handed slap across the face, delivered with cold fury in the damp silence of the linen room. Her wrath was triggered by the smallest failure: a streak left on a pewter plate, a wrinkle in a noble's tunic, or a whispered piece of gossip that made its way back to her. Ilara endured Agnes's discipline several times. The physical pain was sharp, but the deeper injury was the profound humiliation. It was a tangible proof that she possessed no dignity, no rights, and that her body was subject to the whim of her superiors. However, the threat of the master's discipline, delivered by the steward, or worst of all by Lord Beaufort himself, carried a far heavier weight. The Lord's anger was rare but volcanic, reserved for acts perceived as fundamental challenges to his authority, such as theft, fighting, or outright defiance. The fear was not just of the immediate beating, but of the ultimate punishment: dismissal. For a young woman like Ilara, being turned out of a great household was a catastrophe. Dismissal meant ruin of reputation. No other decent household would hire a servant dismissed for misconduct, branding her as unreliable or a thief. Loss of shelter and food. She would instantly lose her only source of sustenance and her bed, forced to join the desperate ranks of the wandering poor. End of the dowry. Her fragile savings and all her dreams of marriage and independence would vanish. This fear made the servants' behavior preternaturally cautious. They moved with a practiced, fearful quickness, always anticipating the next order, always trying to make themselves less visible, less noticeable, and therefore less prone to punishment. Beyond the formal discipline was the terrifying reality of frequent abuses. The manor was a closed environment, and its power dynamics often translated into predatory behavior. Ilara and the other young maids were constantly on guard against the male servants, the pages, and even the occasional visiting noble, who might take advantage of their absolute powerlessness. The Lord's younger son, Master Julian, was known for his casual cruelty. A pinch here, a trip there, or a demand for favors in a dark corridor, knowing full well that no maid would dare refuse or report him. Reporting such abuse would not lead to Julian's punishment. It would almost certainly lead to the maid's punishment for false accusation or impropriety. The shame and the knowledge of her own vulnerability were a constant, invisible torment.
the environment demanded a high level of self-control. Ilara trained herself never to weep, never argue, and never meet the eyes of those above her. She learned to channel her fear into relentless work, pouring her anxiety into the physical exhaustion of fetching water and scrubbing floors. The work itself became a refuge, a focus that allowed her to momentarily escape the paralyzing awareness that her freedom, her safety, and her future rested entirely on the fragile, arbitrary temperament of her masters. She was a ghost, surviving by making her presence as low a price as possible, a silent, compliant body that never failed to execute the task lest the cost of her servitude be exacted in pain and utter destitution. For Ilara and the other servants, the concept of personal time was almost mythical. Life in the manor was a fluid 24-hour expectation of availability. Yet within this rigid structure, there existed tiny, precious slivers, moments of margin, that offered a brief, crucial escape and a reminder of life beyond the back stairs. These moments were not given easily. They were hard-won, strictly limited, and deeply coveted. The most reliable, sanctioned break was the obligation of church. The medieval household, regardless of its wealth, adhered to a rigid Christian calendar. On Sundays and major holy days, such as Christmas, Easter, and certain feast days, the servants were permitted and often required to attend Mass. This was less a day of rest and more a momentary shift in masters. The spiritual demands of God superseded the worldly demands of Lord Beaufort. For Ilara, attending the village church was a psychological lifeline. It was one of the few occasions she could step outside the manor walls without the heavy burden of a specific errand. Standing among the villagers, she was momentarily not a servant of Blackwood, but a member of the wider community. She could exchange fleeting, genuine greetings with people she hadn't seen in weeks, hear news from her home village, and most importantly, stand tall without the constant, terrifying presence of the steward or housekeeper. The church itself, with its soaring, indifferent beauty, offered a strange solace. It was a space grander than the great hall, yet one where Ilara, kneeling beside a wealthy merchant or even a minor noble, was theoretically equal in the eyes of God. This brief, public acknowledgement of her humanity was invaluable. Beyond formal religious holidays, the only other way to legally leave the manor was under the guise of an errand. These errands were usually mundane, fetching a specific medicinal herb from the village apothecary, taking fine linen to the washerwoman, or collecting a letter from a messenger passing through. These chores, though technically work, were seen as miniature voyages of liberation. The few minutes spent walking along the road, breathing air unmixed with the odors of the kitchen and the dormitory, were moments of genuine, unsupervised freedom. Ilara treasured these walks. She learned to maximize the time, walking slowly, savoring the feeling of the sun on her face. She would steal a moment to watch a child play or listen to a joking conversation between villagers that made its way back to Ilara like a bird's song.
Traveling minstrel, sights and sounds utterly forbidden within the manor walls. These brief excursions into the wider world were essential to maintaining her mental resilience, reminding her that the great stone walls did not, in fact, contain the entire world. The most spectacular, though rarest, opportunity for relief was the chance to attend a local fair or market. These events, tied to certain religious feasts or harvest cycles, transformed the quiet local community into a riot of color, noise, and commerce. If the manor was provisioning for a large feast, a high-ranking servant, like the cook or butler, would take a few junior hands, including Ilara if she was lucky, to help carry goods. The fair was pure sensory overload, the smell of exotic spices, the sound of musicians, the sight of jugglers, and the possibility of buying a small luxury with a carefully saved penny, a brightly colored ribbon, or a piece of cheap jewelry. It was a carnival of possibilities, a direct, intoxicating contrast to the drab, controlled routine of the manor. However, even these rare time-off moments were heavily restricted. A servant was only ever granted time off if the work required it, or if the religious calendar demanded it. The time spent outside the walls was tightly monitored. If a servant lingered, returned late, or, worst of all, returned drunk or with unauthorized purchases, the punishment was guaranteed and severe. The margin was narrow, and transgression was costly. Yet it was in these few fleeting hours, kneeling in the sanctuary of the church, or breathing the open air on a necessary errand, that Ilara reaffirmed her identity. These were the moments where she ceased being the Lord's property and became, however temporarily, her own person. These slivers of freedom were the fuel for her hope, the psychological sustenance that allowed her to endure the endless, back-breaking trials of the following weeks. The life of a medieval servant was undeniably one of drudgery and oppression, but for some, the great household also served as an unintentional university. Beneath the heavy yoke of labor, the experience often functioned as a rigorous, years-long apprenticeship, forging unskilled youths into disciplined individuals capable of professional advancement. This upward mobility, however, was starkly divided by gender. For the young men, like the pages and the clerks, the opportunities were clear and structured. Working directly under the butler or the steward, they learned invaluable marketable skills, bookkeeping and literacy. The steward's pages were taught to read and write, managing inventories of grain, calculating wages, and keeping meticulous account ledgers. This knowledge was gold. A literate man could leave service to become a merchant's clerk, a town official, or a bailiff for a smaller estate, a massive leap in social standing. Estate management. Grooms learned the complex care of horses and stables, while others learned construction and repair. These skills set them up to become specialized artisans or tenant managers. The art of command. Serving at the highest tables taught the young men social graces, the nuances of courtly behavior, and the subtle arts of command and delegation, skills vital for future leadership roles. The butler, Master Thomas, for instance, had started as a scullion, but had proven a natural talent for numbers and inventory, meticulously working his way up the hierarchy. His position as butler was not merely high service, it was a highly respected trade that could eventually lead him to running his own tavern or becoming the chief steward for a lower noble. For Ilara and the other young women, the path to training and skill was less direct and less recognized, yet equally essential. Their apprenticeship was focused on the mastery of the domestic arts, skills that were valued in the home but rarely translated into high-status external trades. Culinary expertise, the cook's trade. Ilara's constant grueling work in the kitchen, pounding spices, plucking fowl, maintaining fire temperatures, meant she was learning the sophisticated craft of medieval cookery by osmosis. While she was not allowed to cook the noble dishes, she understood the process, the necessary ingredients, and the timing. If she secured a good marriage, this skill would make her a prized, capable mistress of her own kitchen. Linen and needlework. Under Mistress Agnes, Ilara became adept at the demanding work of laundering fine linens and performing intricate mending and sewing. This skill was crucial for managing a successful middle-class household. Household management. She learned the logistics of provisioning, cleaning, and maintenance, the deep, practical knowledge of how to make a large, complex dwelling function smoothly. This knowledge was the foundation of her promise of a future, but it only held monetary value through marriage. The dowry she was saving was crucial, but the skills she acquired were the true insurance policy for her future husband. A man would seek a wife who brought not just coin, but the competence to manage his home and stretch his resources, a competence honed under the brutal efficiency of Lord Beaufort's household. Ilara felt the unfairness of this disparity acutely. She worked harder than many of the pages, yet her skills were undervalued in the wider market. However, she focused on perfecting every task. She watched Cook Osbert's assistant when he prepared sauces, memorizing the steps. She listened closely when the housekeeper dictated linen inventory. Her goal was not to become the next gentlewoman. It was to become so capable, so essential in the domestic sphere that when the day came to leave, her reputation for skill and diligence, her wares, would be even more valuable than her few shillings of cash. Her servitude was a crucible, burning away her youth, but forging her into a resilient, highly capable manager, ready to be an artisan of her own home.
The great manor of Blackwood was a world unto itself, but it was rarely a permanent home. For almost every servant, the grueling years spent beneath the tapestries were merely a transitional stage, a necessary purgatory leading to a life beyond the castle walls. The day a servant left was the single most anticipated and terrifying moment of their career. For Ilara, the goal of leaving service was the driving force behind every weary bucket carried and every floor scrubbed. Freedom came in three primary paths, each requiring years of calculated effort and a significant stroke of luck. For women like Ilara, the most common and coveted exit was through marriage. Her accumulated shillings and her mastery of domestic skills, the very training acquired through her trials by task, were the tools for this escape. Ilara's opportunity came quietly, after 5 long years of service. Through a cousin who visited on a rare holy day, she was introduced to Thomas, a diligent young carpenter in a nearby market town. Thomas needed a wife who was not only sturdy and healthy, but also possessed the acumen to manage his small, busy household accounts and run his kitchen efficiently. Ilara, with her hard-won dowry and her reputation for flawless management learned under the housekeeper's cruel hand, was exactly what he needed. The process of leaving was nerve-wracking. A servant could not simply quit, they had to request permission from the Lord. Ilara, shaking, presented her petition to the steward, citing her intent to marry a reputable craftsman. Lord Beaufort, seeing no further utility in a maid who wished to divide her loyalty, granted her release with a casual wave of the hand. Her departure was not marked by farewells. She collected her meager belongings, her small bag of precious coins, and the few linen scraps she had saved. She left before dawn, walking down the drive for the final time. The weight of the world once carried in buckets of water lifted, replaced by the lighter yet heavier weight of her own future. She traded her communal pallet in the cold hall for a shared private bed, and the service of a nobleman for the demanding yet self-directed service of building a home. The path for the young men was distinct. The pages who learned to read and calculate, and the stable hands who learned the complex care of war horses, often secured positions in the thriving urban centers. Master Perrin, the valet, did not leave for marriage. After 10 years, when the old Lord Beaufort passed away, Perrin was given a generous annuity, a promised wage for the rest of his life, and a commendation for his discretion. He used his accumulated wealth and his knowledge of aristocratic manners to establish himself as a highly successful cloth merchant in London. His time as a servant was his trade school, teaching him commerce, negotiation, and the art of appearing wealthier than he was. His final act of service bought his permanent seat among the gentry. Not all departures were for complete freedom. For some, the goal was simply a better master. Cook Osbert's assistant, a quiet man named John, endured years of Osbert's tyranny only to gain a reputation as a highly skilled sorcerer.
He was eventually lured away by the steward of a duke's household, a lateral move, but one with higher pay, a private room, and a clearer path to becoming a head cook. He remained a servant, but he upgraded his household, swapping one set of chains for a wreath of higher status, more comfortable ones. Years later, Ilara, now managing a bustling carpenter's shop, sometimes heard the bell tolling for Lord Beaufort's manor in the distance. The memory of the 5 a.m. bell, the biting cold of the back stairs, and the smell of the chamber pots never truly left her. She would always carry the calloused hands and the cautious silence of the silent witness. Her time in the rich medieval household had been brutal, yet formative. It had given her nothing freely, but it had taught her everything she needed to survive: endurance, economy, and the crucial skill of making a home function flawlessly. As she surveyed her own small, warm kitchen, a room she governed entirely by her own will, Ilara understood the full meaning of her journey. She had survived the beneath the tapestry life, and in doing so, she had earned her own place in the sun, proving that even from the lowest point of servitude, a servant could painstakingly carve out her own life after the Lord.